Hi, I'm Supertrain Station H, and welcome to Part 7 of Barrier Aggression, my critical analysis of select material from Autism Confidential, the National Council on Severe Autism's podcast series, where even if a team of doctors at a university subjecting me to days of evaluation and observing multiple atypical neurodevelopmental characteristics and motor deficits somehow does not prove that I'm autistic, the fact that I'm closing in on Hour 8 of my analysis of a 1 hour long podcast from an alleged autism advocacy group most certainly does. Today, the Praetorial Mare State's least favorite worm-infested dog man, me, is going to be describing and presenting reenacted instances of grandiose verbal threats of violence, as well as discussing lethal mental health outcomes leading to the loss of life, the latter of which you can expect is a subject which will be mentioned on occasion going forward. So take care, everybody. Now last time, we were listening to some asshole from a different NCSA podcast episode who accused someone in an almost whistleblowing-like manner of wrongfully representing themselves as autistic to participate on an autism advisory board they apparently had no business belonging to. Now, this asshole's proof of this person wrongfully representing themselves as autistic was the fact that they were diagnosed with a pervasive developmental disorder that the current Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders assigned as autism spectrum disorder. Yes, his proof for his accusation that he did not have an official diagnosis of autism was the fact that he literally had an official diagnosis of autism. I'm not even fucking kidding. That's just what that man actually said, unless he somehow explained his point so poorly that he did so in a way that I guess what he said in the podcast somehow had absolutely nothing to do with anything he intended to actually communicate. Now, I am of the personal opinion that NCSA President Jill Escher didn't give a shit what this guy said in terms of its actuality, as long as whatever he said encouraged skepticism and distrust toward the legitimacy of autistic people that Jill considers higher functioning. People who Jill says are not only completely functional and absent of neurodevelopmental disability, but thrive and flourish in privilege, while autistic people like her children suffer.
You do have some people who are very quirky socially and, have some slight sensory and behavioral challenges, and they might be diagnosed with autism. They might be fully functional, independent adults. They might have college degrees. They might have successful careers. They might be married. They might have children, but they might be given the same diagnosis as my nonverbal children who can't read, who can't write, who can't talk, who can't play with toys, who lack almost any abstract thought. Yeah. So it's this absurd overbreadth of the autism definition. So the people at that very, very high end of autism who are super privileged, right?
But yeah, I think this has been one of the great debacles of autism, right? That, people who are cognitively, have strong cognitive abilities, strong communication abilities, strong adaptive abilities, but have kind of social quirks are in the same category, the same diagnostic category as my kids who are nonverbal and function like at a preschool level.
And that's a problem.
It's absurd. It's not just a problem. It's violently absurd. It's radically absurd.
They try.
Jill and her friends at the NCSA discourage the public from distrusting these people for being diagnosed in the first place and hold them to task for accessing disability supports and special education they say is for true autistic people. Meanwhile, the low support needs, aka relatively higher functioning autistic people they are complaining about, often can only operate as well as they do in the context of the non-disabled world, specifically because they received years of therapy, training, treatment, accommodations, and intervention that they only had access to because they were able to clinically diagnosed to begin with. As for people who happen to have profiles that would have likely made them candidates for testing and services relating to neurodevelopmental disability if those resources and capabilities had been in place during those childhoods for their detection, well,
too bad, bitch.
Getting a clinical diagnosis of ASD later in life, according to some of these NCSA people, isn't proof of you being autistic. It's proof of you being a non-disabled person who chose to impersonate autistic traits and jump on board an identity-based social justice movement that wants to abandon personal responsibility and erase and cancel real autistic people and their parents. Now, of course, none of that applies if you are diagnosed with ASD as an adult and you're submissive to the NCSA's agenda and you personally refuse to identify as autistic in spite of your actual diagnosis of ASD. In that case, Jill might bring you on her show as an esteemed guest and talk about how brave and intelligent you are in spite of your struggle against disability, or something like that. You know, it's almost like these people are fucking stupid.
It boggles my mind, and it shouldn't be that way. It's completely irrational.
Well, regarding autistic people of all support needs levels, the resources and supports that benefit autistic people can vary significantly and can be as intensive as perpetual therapy sessions to enable a higher support needs, aka lower functioning autistic person to be safe and comfortable and constructively occupied within an enclosed environment of round-the-clock care, or be as simple as a pair of ear protectors to mitigate auditory sensory overload and allow a lower support needs, aka higher functioning autistic person to interact in public out in the non-disabled world or focus on complex tasks like writing or schoolwork. Now, when it comes to the latter, I have a lot of experience with that sort of equipment in a variety of forms. Some types can reduce decibels to lower the ambient volume of an environment. Others only reflect high frequencies and allow most sound through without lowering the decibel level. Most are specifically designed not to completely isolate the wearer, and to allow them to hear verbal speech and communicate with those around them, which is critical since these are often also worn by construction workers and technicians who operate or work near dangerous vehicles and industrial equipment. They must be able to sense danger in their environment and conduct themselves safely. Now, I used to have a retail job in a huge building that had a food court with tables that could be used by customers or by workers during their lunch breaks. I used to like to write during my lunch breaks using one of my many portable word processing machines that I've carried with me literally everywhere I go in various forms since childhood. And when I write in public, I'm usually wearing decibel-reducing earmuffs. Every day I would sit by myself with my word processor and a couple of dictionaries on the table, and I would quietly eat my lunch and write until my break was over. Now, there was a coworker who worked in a different department who ate lunch around the same time as me. And in spite of the fact that I did nothing to attract attention to myself, this coworker decided that I was interfering with his ability to enjoy the food court. One day, completely without provocation, he confronted me to inform me of his opinion of me and suggest that I go somewhere else, which I refused to do. The next time the man confronted me, I waved over to the police to help defuse the situation, since there was coincidentally a police kiosk with officers stationed at it directly beside the table where I always sat in this food court. That was a convenient coincidence. Now, the police informed the man that he was being unreasonable and that I was doing nothing wrong, and that if he didn't want to eat lunch in public with other people during his break, he was free to eat somewhere else, but that I had every right to sit quietly and mind my business. Another day came, and during my lunch break, the man sat down at a nearby table, called his friend on his cell phone, and began to very loudly complain about me to his friend about how disgusting and nasty I was, and how I was bothering everyone around me, and that I was harassing him during his lunch break. And he went on to say that people like me were constantly being allowed to get away with acting in a disgusting manner without risk of facing consequences, and that he was going to give me the beating of my life as punishment for my actions.
Hi, hey Rob. Yeah, I'm at work on my lunch break. That disgusting piece of shit they hired that I was telling you about is sitting a few tables over from me. He's such a nasty motherfucker, I can barely eat my food. Every day, he makes my lunch break miserable. and I've warned him multiple times to get the fuck away from me and leave me alone. But he keeps bothering me because he is a disgusting piece of shit with no fucking respect. He called the cops on me once before for absolutely no reason, and the police are such nasty motherfuckers that they sided with him and told me that I was out of line when all I was doing was telling that stupid piece of shit to stop being nasty in public and go the fuck where he belongs. But not only did they allow him to stay and continue harassing me and being disgusting, but they told me to stop talking to him and to stop complaining about him. I'm 53 years old and shouldn't have to deal with this shit from these fucking kids. If one of my own kids was as disgusting as this piece of shit, I would have gotten rid of them years ago, and I swear to God, if this motherfucker doesn't get the fuck out of my face, I'm going to beat the ever-loving shit out of him right here and now, and if he's still conscious, I'm going to pound his fucking head in until he can't remember his own name. I don't care if they find it, because I'd rather be unemployed than spend one more day working for a shifty company like this that not only hires people like him, but insults my dignity as a man by demanding that I allow him to mistreat me day after day. Motherfuckers like him are ruining everything, and these companies refuse to take action and give nasty-ass bitches like these justice they deserve. And if I don't take action and defend myself from him, no one will, and I'm going to knock him the fuck out right here in front of everyone, because no one has ever been treated as unfairly as I have been by him. The police are right here looking at me right now, and I don't give a shit, because it's going to take a dozen cops to pull me off of him. And I'd rather get arrested than live in a lawless society where people like him can treat me like shit day in and day out. And when he wakes up in the hospital, he'll finally understand that there are consequences to treating people like shit, and he is going to pay the price for what he's done to me. I'd be happy to spend the rest of my life in prison if it means I can pay back even a fraction of the harm he has dealt to me on a daily basis for the past several months, because nasty motherfuckers like him don't deserve to feel safe, and I will beat him so badly that he will feel unsafe wherever he goes for the rest of his fucking life.
Believe it or not, that was a pretty faithful representation of the nature of what he was saying. Exaggerated only very slightly, because half of it was absolutely unintelligible, and he was so unhinged that I was very nearly expecting him to begin reciting the Navy SEALs copy pasta and start threatening me with ICBMs. It was literally a supervillain manifesto come to life. Now, he continued to loudly make grandiose threats of physical violence against me as retribution for what he called my disgusting behavior. He shouted about how he was going to beat the ever-loving shit out of me for being a nasty motherfucker, and declared that he didn't care if he got fired or went to prison, and that it would take a dozen police officers to pull him off of me, and that I deserved it for treating him so unfairly, day after day. He loudly and proudly said all of this about me to his friend on the phone, apparently assuming that I couldn't hear any of it due to me wearing noise-reducing earmuffs, which he mistook for headphones. And he said this without any regard to the presence of multiple police officers stationed nearby who were already wary of him due to his prior antisocial behavior towards me. Well, in the immediate aftermath of this incident, that man was permanently removed from the property and permanently removed from his employment at that establishment, with the police revoking his permission to re-enter the property. So, what was it that I was doing that pissed this man off so much? Well, throughout his prolonged menacing tirade that he spat into the phone about how terrible I was, something that I omitted from my earlier recreation, he was ranting and raving and making repeated accusations that I was bothering him and others by playing loud music on my headphones and ruining the ability for others to enjoy themselves and eat peacefully. Yes, He was angry at me and considered me disgusting and nasty, and declared that he was going to beat the ever-loving shit out of me until it took a dozen police officers to pull him off of me, because he was mad at me for blasting loud music on my headphones, which were actually noise-suppressing earmuffs that had no speakers in them, and thus were incapable of producing music or sound of any kind. There was no one present in the area in which we were sitting that could have been the source of the alleged loud music. There was no music playing anywhere in the space, and no one else could have possibly been around for him to be making his accusation against. It was specifically me he was going to punish for my alleged antisocial act of blasting loud music with my headphones and ruining his lunch break day after day. He was as angry at me as one person could possibly be at someone else, to the point of making grandiose threats of physical violence toward me, as well as the police, who were already immediately present in the food court, over me doing something to offend him that I only not wasn't doing, but couldn't possibly have done if I wanted to. I can't put myself in such a fractured state of mind that I would form an elaborate narrative over someone having wronged me in ways that not only didn't happen, but were physically impossible to have taken place. But that's what that man did to me, because I was sitting silently by myself, wearing noise-suppressing earmuffs so that I could focus on writing poetry during my lunch break. Whether or not that man, who even as a co-worker, I never even spoke to or interacted with before, suspected I was on the autism spectrum or not, whether he recognized my noise-suppressing earmuffs and word processor as disability aids or not, his unprovoked hostility toward me demonstrates the well-established risk of verbal aggression, physical violence, and various mistreatment that autistic people and disabled people in general face in the outside world, should non-disabled people perceive us as being abnormal, weird, or unusual in even the most harmless-seeming of ways. Even if that man turned out not to have had the slightest idea that I was autistic, his perception of my presence as disruptive, disrespectful, and dangerous still demonstrates that reality and still put me in immediate danger. And even ignoring the disability aspect, I think that getting angry at a stranger over something they not only didn't do, but something that never even happened at all, is behavior that I find to be extreme and weird. Let's check in on Jill Escher, president of the National Council on Severe Autism, and hear her opinion on behavior she thinks is extreme and weird and that's harming autistic people.
But yeah, I mean, I think this has been one of the great debacles of autism, right? That, you know, people who are cognitively, have strong cognitive abilities, strong communication abilities, strong adaptive abilities, but have kind of social quirks, are in the same category, the same diagnostic category as my kids who are nonverbal and function like at a preschool level.
And
like,
that's a problem.
It's absurd. It's not just a problem. I mean, it's violently absurd. It's radically absurd.
Wow. Jill considers the fact that high-functioning autistic people have the word autism in their diagnosis to be violently absurd. Whether she'd like to rephrase that or not, it communicates a moral landscape in which a clinically diagnosed autistic person who can do things that Jill's children cannot is therefore culpable of validating violent injustice towards Jill's children by describing themselves using their actual diagnostic nomenclature. Well, that's fucking scary. Not in the way that Jill thinks. So let's find out what else Jill Escher thinks is extreme and weird and harmful to autistic people.
So I think we're going to talk about like just an example of how extreme and weird this whole kind of, vocabulary fail has been, and I consider autism to be a complete vocabulary fail. I'm going to do a little bit of reading here. They ran this article. Doctors with autism speak out against stigma. All right, so never mind the fact that neither of my children even understand what a doctor is. But, they use doctors with autism. And
Boy, oh boy.
All right, let's start from the top.
So I think we're going to talk about just an example of how extreme and weird this whole kind of, vocabulary fail has been. And I consider autism to be a complete vocabulary fail.
This is probably going to be the most insignificant observation I think I'll make in my entire video series, but vocabulary fail? I mean, not that there's anything seriously wrong with Jill saying that. I understand her intention, which matters more than grammatical technicalities of correctness. But that phrasing just seems unexpectedly post-millennial in its tone for someone who's old enough to be my parent, who I'd expect to use a phrase more along the lines of vocabulary failure. I mean, just as an English language dork that reads Elements of Style for fun, that just happens to stick out to me. On a more meaningful note, if Jill considers the word autism to be a failed piece of vocabulary in the post-DSM-5 landscape, I'd like to know what she'd have to say about the DSM-4 era reports of licensed clinicians being misled by the similarities between the old DSM-4 constructions of former autism disorder and former Asperger's syndrome. It got to the point that there were numbers of documented cases of doctors mistakenly assigning Asperger's syndrome diagnoses to patients who actually should have been diagnosed with autism disorder and who required the more intensive supports that diagnosis opened up to patients. It's especially ironic considering that a lot of critics of high-functioning autism like to make the, implication that Asperger's disorder had nothing to do with autism disorder in the old DSM-4, and that therefore they should have never been combined in the DSM-5, when actually the definition of Asperger's disorder as it existed in the DSM-4 overlapped so much with the definition of autism disorder that the opening text for the Asperger's disorder literally says to go back and reread parts of the autism disorder diagnosis. Now, people being assigned Asperger's disorder who needed to be assigned autism disorder under the old DSM-4 before those two diagnoses were effectively merged, that's a direct disservice to autistic people with higher support needs, aka relatively lower functioning. People a lot closer to the description of autism that Jill is specifically concerned with providing better conditions for and promoting understanding and awareness for. That problem was part of what the DSM-5 attempted to address with its construction of autism spectrum disorder, even if there may be opportunities for improvement on top of that.
So I think we're going to talk about just an example of how extreme and weird this whole kind of, vocabulary fail has been. And I consider autism to be a complete vocabulary fail.
Now, Jill's idea of the word autism as a failed piece of vocabulary is that the Spectrum News organization put out an article describing people who were diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder as being autistic. It really should have been at this point that I ought to have just accepted that this person is full of shit and didn't deserve to be taken seriously or be given the benefit of the doubt. Now, if calling someone autistic because they are clinically diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder is a complete vocabulary fail, then it's a complete arithmetic fail to say that 2 + 2 = 4 just because adding 2 to 2 results in a total of 4. Now that's very different than Jill challenging the DSM-5 construction of ASD, because Many people, aside from Jill, who has some kind of weird-ass problem, have made extensive arguments against the DSM-5 construction of ASD, without holding end-level patients in public contempt for describing themselves with their actual diagnostic nomenclature. But for Jill and her friends from the Kennedy Krieger Institute, in this podcast, they seem to be holding ASD-1 responsible for having stolen something from their children and patients, and that's just fucking nasty and silly for them to do. Speaking of silly.
So I think we're going to talk about like just an example of how extreme and weird this whole kind of, vocabulary fail has been. And I consider autism to be a complete vocabulary fail. So there's, most of you people out there in the listener land have heard of Spectrum News.
No, I never heard of this before.
Most of you people out there in the listener land have heard of Spectrum News. Spectrum News is published by the Simons Foundation, which is a private foundation that is funded exclusively, as far as I know, through the wealth of one man, which is Jim Simons. He's one of the wealthiest people in the United States. I've never met him. He seems to be a very good guy and very, very smart. I have nothing against him. But he also funds this thing called Spectrum News. The foundation funds it, which is editorially independent of his foundation, but dependent on the foundation's money. And they regularly, really on a daily basis, on the weekdays at least, churn out news stories and features. And they have a very, very strong neurodiversity bias in their reporting.
Okay, neurodiversity. Now, I read a basic overview from harvard.edu on neurodiversity back in part 6 of Barrier Aggression. But in short, I don't think I'll step on anyone's toes by describing that neurodiversity essentially rejects the approach that any aspect or trait of one's brain functionality that serves as an observable deviation from typical human brain characteristics is therefore a negative characteristic that must be pathologized. A strictly pathological approach might take any divergence from typicality as something that needs to be treated or suppressed or cured, whether or not it's actually causing the person any pain or suffering. To take a personal example that's close to me, let's consider a theoretical child who has debilitating chronic migraines and sensory events, and plays with their toys by shaking them while pacing in circles for hours. A strictly pathological approach might be to test the child for medication or special glasses that block light wavelengths that trigger headaches and alleviate headache symptoms when they do strike. But it would also prescribe training or therapy that seeks to condition the child to play with their toys as most children would. This could include actually verbally or physically punishing the child or denying positive attention to them if they fail to impersonate the typical toy-playing behavior of a non-autistic person. So-called therapy of this nature actually exists, and people who criticize it, including autistic people who experienced it firsthand and suffered life-changing trauma as a result, are often accused of being radical revisionists who are the enemies of true autistic people because they shared their experiences and concerns, because supposedly they don't want autistic people who are suffering to become successful and normal. An approach more aligned with the neurodiversity paradigm might seek to find a way to prevent the debilitating headaches and alleviate the symptoms when they strike, but wouldn't intervene with the child's enjoyment of playing with toys in odd ways like arranging them in patterns or shaking them while pacing, unless it was posing some sort of health or safety hazard. It would instead seek to reject pathologizing characteristics that cause no harm other than upsetting neurotypical or non-autistic people simply because it wasn't seen as normal. NCSA members and allies have a habit of using the phrases neurodiversity, autistic self-advocacy, and high-functioning autism as though they were interchangeable, and they are not. and the idea that clinically diagnosed autistic people communicating their own experiences and advocating for themselves was a newly invented concept that never existed prior to the DSM-5 in 2013 is just explicitly historically incorrect. Yet Jill Escher, president of the National Council on Severe Autism, an outfit that accepts charitable donations from the public so that they can educate people about autism, has been seen agreeing with and endorsing messages of that exact nature.
That's the problem with we got rid of Asperger's as a condition, and it was sort of subsumed into the autism spectrum disorder umbrella in 2013, and that's where I think a lot of the issues we're currently having come from, because I think neurodiversity movement, that would have been fine if it was just Asperger's, like, yes, you have a difference, not a disability. 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 Yes, you have a difference, not a disability.
Neurodiversity is a paradigm and a concept, not a bespoke group or party. There are various degrees to how far people and organizations within and outside of the autism community and of other disabilities that are related to this paradigm are willing to go with it. But there's often a strong rejection of the idea of a cure for autism, whatever that could mean. Those in favor of a cure for autism can be subject to extreme backlash from neurodiversity proponents. They could even be accused of hating their own children. And when parents of children who will need 24-hour care their entire lives hear things like that, I think it's natural for them to get upset. But there are also a lot of complexities as to the nature of what an autism cure could mean, if such a thing were even a biological possibility. And that alone is the subject for hours of videos I can't trouble myself with making, because frankly, it's taking all the time and energy I have just to prepare the 2 remaining episodes of Bear Aggression I have planned after this one. Years ago, I saw an interview on YouTube that I sadly cannot find for the life of me. I wish I could. I spent hours looking for it. But the non-autistic host was discussing neurodiversity with an older autistic man who I understand to be a higher support needs person that would probably be considered moderately or severely autistic by the NSCA. This autistic person rejected neurodiversity. He explicitly said that he was 100% in favor of a cure for autism if such a thing came to exist, because he wanted to be alleviated of his challenges and live a fuller life. But interestingly, he immediately also said that he would not accept such a cure for himself if it erased his unique experience of how he perceived the world. There were a bunch of neurodiversity proponents in the comments saying things to the effect of, wait, he's literally agreeing with the neurodiversity paradigm by saying that we want to eliminate suffering, but we don't want to erase our unique personalities and perspectives and experiences of being human. So yeah, that's neurodiversity in a nutshell, without doing an entire lecture on that one topic alone. Jill and her friends at the NCSA are not fans of it, which is their opinion to have, even if their understanding of that concept sometimes seems cursory at best.
Autism Acceptance Month, neurodiversity. My kids don't have neurodiversity. They have serious mental disorder. Serious neurodevelopmental disorder.
Now, first off, I need to say immediately, it seriously concerns me that Jill is the president of a nonprofit that's supposed to be providing national leadership on educating the public on autism and leading the introduction of laws that impact the rights and services autistic people have access to. But they're saying things like this.
Autism Acceptance Month, neurodiversity. My kids don't have neurodiversity. They have serious mental disorder. Serious neurodevelopmental disorder.
Now, Jill just used the terms mental disorder and neurodevelopmental disorder as though they were fungible with each other, and they are not. Jill does this consistently on social media as well. like in this tweet where she's making unsolicited complaints targeting Bill Gates. So this wasn't a slip of the tongue. This is something Jill does intentionally, routinely. Autism is not a mental disorder, and people who know nothing about these things like to call out autistic self-advocates for saying that, accusing the self-advocates of falsely claiming that autism isn't a mental disorder as part of a campaign to spread misinformation about autism and twist it into a quirky social movement of non-disabled overgrown children that are choosing to appropriate the struggles of the disabled and reject responsibility for their own lives. But these critics are people who think they're correct and calling autism itself a mental illness, when that is, as a clinical matter of fact, literally not the case. It's true that autism spectrum disorder is in the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM, but that series of manuals was named in the mid-20th century, prior to decades and decades of breakthroughs in science, medicine, and psychology, and before neurodevelopmental disorders in the modern sense were even understood as such. So thanks to supposed experts like Jill using mental disorder and neurodevelopmental disorder interchangeably, we now have disability skeptics thinking that they're valid in challenging the trustworthiness of autistics when they explain that autism isn't a mental illness, when that's literally objectively true, all while it remains an ongoing and separate problem. That mental illness is stigmatized to the point where those living with it are marked as unworthy of consideration, which costs mentally ill and neurodevelopmentally disabled people their lives, both from violence inflicted by outsiders and by suicide. Speaking of which, some of these critics of high-functioning autism get so extreme and vicious in their beliefs that they sometimes don't even care if high-functioning autistic people actually fucking kill themselves. But this is Jill Escher we're talking about here, who is at the very least the president of a credible autism advocacy organization. Allegedly.
Autism Acceptance Month, neurodiversity. You know, my kids don't have neurodiversity. They have serious mental disorder. Serious neurodevelopmental disorder. Their brains were formed improperly and abnormally.
Your children's brains were improperly formed, Jill. You know, I really wouldn't mind advances that allow autism and other disabilities to be better understood, so I really can't wait to hear Jill's evidence for this.
Their brains were formed improperly and abnormally. We should be calling it what it is. These are supposed to be scientific organizations, and now all they're doing is using like romanticizing language that kind of normalizes patent disability.
Have they done like MRI scans on the brains and found abnormalities in your kids?
Oh, in my kids? No.
Oh. Never mind then. Jill Escher doesn't need evidence. She's the Grand Magister of Autism. She doesn't need proof. All she needs to do is say things, and that makes them real. Her powers as the advanced controller of autism are so vast and glorious, she can literally just erase people from existence simply by refusing to mention them. And I'm glad she left that moment in, because I can't tell if her having removed it, or rather failed to have removed it, was a personal choice to just reflect an honest depiction of the discussion as it actually unfolded, or if Jill is actually so unaware of how strange this moment is that she didn't even consider it as a potential hiccup in her image of being credible on these topics. I personally don't think she is, but that's just the opinion of a cartoon dog on the internet.
Their brains were formed improperly and abnormally. We should be calling it what it is.
Have they done like MRI scans on the brains and found abnormalities in your kids?
Oh, in my kids? No. Autism Acceptance Month, neurodiversity. You know, my kids don't have neurodiversity.
Jill, the neurodiversity paradigm itself would not describe your children as having quote-unquote neurodiversity. The fact that she thinks neurodiversity is a synonym for autism itself shows a fundamental lack of understanding of what she's criticizing. Here, in another NCSA video, a lecture by Dr. Lee Wachtel about a 2021 administrative terminology proposal by the Lancet Commission, we see in the description, whoever at the NCSA wrote this copy seems to think that the word neurodiversity is synonymous with high-functioning autism, which is as stupid and incorrect as saying that a single individual person can have racial diversity. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of what the dictionary or of what well-informed people mean when this word is used. Criticizing the neurodiversity paradigm while expressing a misunderstanding that said paradigm considers autism itself as, quote, a neurodiversity, is parallel to criticizing business practices within the video game industry while thinking that all video game consoles are called Nintendos. I really don't think that Jill is wrong for voicing criticism of aspects of the neurodiversity paradigm that she herself sees as problematic, but her credibility in doing so is significantly damaged because she exhibits these sorts of misconceptions. It makes me wonder how much she actually bothered to learn about this stuff that she's using her position as the head of an autism advocacy group to speak out against, especially when Jill and her friends consider the neurodiversity paradigm to be an antagonistic force to the NCSA, and when NCSA personalities have this habit of describing the neurodiversity paradigm and high-functioning autism and the autism self-advocacy movement as though those were all terms for describing the same thing. Whether anyone embraces neurodiversity or not, that's concretely untrue. It's no wonder that the NCSA seems to have a tendency to discuss high-functioning autistic people as an adversarial faction to the NCSA, which is dangerous and fucked up for reasons I shouldn't have to explain. Anyway, Jill is upset because Mr. Simons funds a paper that she says supports neurodiversity. That's established, so we can move on now.
But he also funds this thing called Spectrum News. The foundation funds it, which is editorially independent of his foundation, but dependent on the foundation's money. And they regularly, really on a daily basis, on the weekdays at least, churn out news stories and features. And they have a very, very strong neurodiversity bias in their reporting. I don't think anybody would disagree with me. Basically, all the researchers I talk to roll their eyes half the time at the features that appear in Spectrum News. Most people don't even read it anymore.
Most people don't read it anymore, huh, Jill? I mean, even if Spectrum News turned out to totally suck ass. That's a weird thing for Jill to say, in my opinion. Because it just feels incomplete. It just feels like there was something like weirdly personal to that statement. And as minor as that is, it just grabs my attention for some reason that I have to point out.
And they regularly, really on a daily basis, on the weekdays at least, churn out news stories and features. And they have a very, very strong neurodiversity bias in their reporting. I don't think anybody would disagree with me. Basically, all the researchers I talk to roll their eyes half the time at the features that appear in Spectrum News. Most people don't even read it anymore.
I think you mean that most of your friends and colleagues, who are probably your friends and colleagues because you generally agree on issues important to you, don't read it anymore. I'm a neurodiversity proponent, at least to the extent of what that paradigm means to me personally. I have neurodiversity stickers and patches on my car, on my jackets, on my many word processors, and on the pouches and bags I use to carry those word processors. And I never, in my life, heard of or read Spectrum News before. Not only have I never read Spectrum News, but I would have went the rest of my life without knowing it existed. I have no stake in vouching for the popularity or the veracity of Spectrum News. So Jill, it may be true that I'm on part 7 now of a multi-hour breakdown of your 1-hour podcast. But I think even in that context, you're a little too deep into this. I don't think Spectrum News is anything close to being as much of a big deal as you're making it out to be, Jill. Now, aside from that, the fact that Spectrum News has fallen out of favor with you and your friends for carrying neurodiversity articles when you and your friends don't like the neurodiversity paradigm, I mean, it just doesn't prove anything. It's like vegans boycotting a steakhouse. Or even more than that, it's like neurodiversity proponents refusing to subscribe to the NCSA YouTube channel. But I sub to your channel, because I like you a lot.
Now don't take that too serious.
And they have a very, very strong neurodiversity bias in their reporting. I don't think anybody would disagree with me. Basically, all the researchers I talk to roll their eyes half the time at the features that appear in Spectrum News. Most people don't even read it anymore.
Not that this is a serious point, Jill, but what if some of the researchers you talk to about Spectrum News never heard of it and only know of it now because you gave them a biased, sardonic explanation of some of the articles they ran that you probably summarized in the most dishonest, condescending manner possible? And aside from that, the researchers you talk to are probably not fans of neurodiversity and therefore wouldn't have liked Spectrum News in the first place anyway. Now, whether or not Spectrum News sucked ass, they at the very least suck at self-promotion, given that I never heard of them. But Jill, I once again mention, I think you're overselling their importance a bit, even in the course of you trying to downplay their credibility. All you've done is make me aware of these people who I otherwise would have went the rest of my life not really caring about.
And they have a very, very strong neurodiversity bias in their reporting. I don't think anybody would disagree with me, but you see sometimes they take a very uncritical approach to neurodiversity. And just recently.
So Jill wants to talk about bias, and it may be the case that Spectrum News is explicitly biased toward neurodiversity. I have no stake in proving otherwise, and I certainly won't spend time reading a bunch of their articles after I already read over 60 Federal Autism Advisory Committee member biographies back in Part 5 of Barrier Aggression to verify Jill's claim of a takeover by that group of fake autistic people, only to find out that just 8 actually, out of maybe 64 of the members describe themselves as autistic in any way. But Jill thinks that Spectrum News is biased. That's fine, even if it is. Jill is being overtly biased by framing the neurodiversity paradigm at its core of being intrinsically antithetical to science or research into autism and human neurological variation. Sometimes people feel that way, but research is done by people who embrace the neurodiversity paradigm, and it's conducted from the standpoint that even atypical characteristics or behaviors in a brain profile aren't therefore automatically negative traits that need to be pathologized and treated in the pursuit of normality. Instead, this paradigm just believes that they should be understood and learned about for the sake of helping that person live safely and happily as themselves. And leading autism self-advocacy groups such as ASAN do embrace the fact that there are aspects of disability to autism. And like I said, ASAN isn't neurodiversity high command, but they certainly are at the forefront of the neurodiversity scene in terms of organized movements or organized specific organizations go. Even with that being said, I personally think that the neurodiversity concept best serves people in the disability community in certain specific ways when it's kept distinct from the field of academic inquiry into autism and formal definitions of disability. In certain ways, I feel that when those things are kept slightly distinct from each other in certain aspects, certain very specific aspects, it lets disabled people addressed by the neurodiversity paradigm maintain a consistent sense of community and identity, even as official terminology inevitably shifts to reflect the latest science. And when I talk about possible future terminology changes to autism and other disabilities, I mean for those possible changes to be based on the latest science and not the lobbying of these crass NCSA Karens who are offended that their children and patients are on the higher support needs end of a scientifically recognized spectrum disorder, in which people on the lower support needs end may need less support than their own high support needs children and patients who are also autistic. Did I mention that these people are fucking stupid yet?
But you see sometimes they take a very uncritical approach to neurodiversity. And just recently, I'm going to do a little bit of reading here. They ran this article. Doctors with autism speak out against stigma. All right, so never mind the fact that neither of my children even understand what a doctor is. But they use doctors with autism. And
wow.
So I think we're going to talk about just an example of how extreme and weird they ran this article. Doctors with autism speak out against stigma. All right, so never mind the fact that neither of my children even understand what a doctor is. But they use doctors with autism. And
with an attitude like that, I'd rather trust the Joker to protect Gotham City than trust Jill Escher as president of the NCSA to protect autistic people.
And here we go.
What kind of autism advocacy group finds it to be a constructive use of charitably donated resources to hold public indignation meetings against diagnosed autistic people, calling them extreme and weird simply for speaking out against stigma that is known to be faced by autistic people of all support needs levels who enter the workforce in their adult lives?
Doctors with autism speak out against stigma. Never mind the fact that neither of my children even understand what a doctor is. But they use doctors with autism. And
Jill, you're using the challenges of your so-described severely autistic children to hoist your resentment toward other clinically diagnosed autistic people you have never even fucking met. And it seems to me like that resentment is founded upon your personal dislike for the name of their diagnosis being autism spectrum disorder, which is something they, as end-level patients, didn't name themselves. To me, that is extreme and weird. And if it's even true that you believe that, because I'm just guessing.
Never mind the fact that neither of my children even understand what a doctor is.
Or even worse, it could be based on your personal dislike of the fact that these people are serving as doctors while having documented neurodevelopmental disabilities. If that was true, even though it's just a guess, but if that was true, that would make you a disability bigot, Jill. Neither of those options sound attractive to you, and the nasty thing is, it doesn't seem unreasonable to speculate that both of those things might be true to you, at least at the time that you recorded yourself saying those things, and later on, a few months later, when you approved of it being published to the public.
Never mind the fact that neither of my children even understand what a doctor is.
Jill, in what way are your severely disabled children's lives better because you used their limitations to validate your resentment against disabled strangers? Jill, I'm not invalidating the struggles of your children, but as people you describe as, unfortunately, being unable to even process these concepts regardless of how long they may live, they should not be used as dead rates for you to elevate your unhinged resentment towards strangers, let alone disabled strangers, who are speaking out against stigma faced by working disabled people. especially not when you're the president of an autism advocacy nonprofit that has specific platform positions about helping autistic people work their way into the community through employment programs and be less hidden, more visible, and hopefully be better understood without misconceptions, which would enhance public empathy for their struggles and popularize support for allocation of societal resources to better provide for them as consumers of medical and psychiatric services with unlimited demand for perpetual lifelong assistance, which someone has to pay for somehow or another. But why should helping them matter to you, Jill, when you can instead make a spectacle of yourself making big fucking oopsie statements about strangers that happens to not reflect reality?
But yeah, I mean, I think this has been one of the great debacles of autism, right? That, you know, people who are cognitively, have strong cognitive abilities, strong communication abilities, strong adaptive abilities, but have kind of social quirks are in the same category, the same diagnostic category as my kids who are nonverbal and function like at a preschool level.
And
like,
that's a problem.
It's absurd. It's not just a problem. I mean, it's violently absurd. It's radically absurd.
All right, Jill, let's hear about how extreme and weird these infamous doctors with autism really are.
These doctors with autism. And here we are told, when Tahlil Javed received a formal diagnosis for autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder at 27 years old.
Why do I have a feeling that Jill is so butthurt over Dr. Javed's autism diagnosis that she's going to totally ignore the implications of her ADHD co-diagnosis and then complain that Dr. Javed got diagnosed with anything in the first place, while also claiming that she respects Dr. Javed's struggles in spite of having already explicitly disrespected her struggles. I looked ahead. Jill's totally gonna do the dumb thing.
Yeah, like Dr. Javed probably has something going on and probably has challenges. I do not deny her problems, right?
Hey, Jill, I'm gonna let you in on a little secret. Saying that you respect someone doesn't mean that you respect someone. Respecting someone means that you respect someone. And I think you have a big problem with respect. I know I'm being disrespectful to you, but I don't respect you. That's the point. I'm not fucking lying to the public about respecting people that I don't. I don't like you.
These doctors with autism. And here we are told, when Tahlil Javed received a formal diagnosis for autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder at 27 years old, she felt shock, confusion, and relief. Certain reactions began to make sense, like all the times she had felt overwhelmed by noise on the bus and missed her stop, or when she had a full-blown panic attack after a challenging conversation at work. For as long as I can remember, I've not felt I belonged anywhere up until the diagnosis, she wrote in an email. Javed is a psychiatric doctor in the UK and has what is called high-functioning autism, she says, meaning that she's able to live independently, but can have trouble with sensory overload, communication, and expressing emotions. The condition is typically diagnosed later in life. Surveys estimate that about 1% of doctors, primarily GPs and psychiatrists, are autistic. Many hide their diagnosis from their colleagues because they worry they will be stigmatized.
I gotta love that strong, sarcastic intonation Jill put on the word stigmatized. It really shows how much respect that she has for these people's struggles, and that was sarcasm, by the way.
Surveys estimate that about 1% of doctors, primarily GPs and psychiatrists, are autistic. Many hide their diagnosis from their colleagues because they worry they will be stigmatized. Never mind that the fact this survey they're referring to was conducted by a ideological group. And I think it was very, very questionable methods, but nevertheless.
So Jill wants to discredit this survey on the basis that it was conducted by what she calls an ideological group. Jill, maybe it was conducted by an ideological group with a biased agenda. It's hard to know, because for a radical ideological group that Jill is so concerned with for their act of damaging autism discourse, she doesn't mention them by name or provide a link to them or info about them and how awful they are, because that's totally how whistleblowing works, right? I mean, once again, with the NCSA, I found it to be the case more often than not. If they don't provide a link or mention names, I've found it to be the case that they'd rather you not know about something, that if we were to know about it, it might make them look sneaky or naughty for publishing messages without giving proper perspective. In fact, not only does the NCSA refuse to link to or mention this alleged ideological group that conducted this survey mentioned within the article, the NCSA also refuses to link to the Spectrum News article at all. The article that's the backbone for the NCSA's entire public complaint session. It's almost like the NCSA is afraid of what will happen if people read the article that they are bitching about and find out something that they would rather their podcast audience not be aware of.
Surveys estimate that about 1% of doctors, primarily GPs and psychiatrists, are autistic. Many hide their diagnosis from their colleagues because they worry they will be stigmatized. Never mind that the fact this survey they're referring to was conducted by a ideological group. And I think it was very, very questionable methods, but nevertheless.
So, who is Jill actually complaining about? Is it the Autistic Doctors International that's mentioned in the article? I assumed so myself. It was a seemingly obvious choice, but apparently not. I had to do a lot of digging because the NCSA doesn't provide links, and apparently this ideological group that Jill is upset about for saying that a whopping 1% of doctors are autistic is Cambridge University? Or at least a team within Cambridge. I mean, oh no, that's the college that hired that autistic professor that looks like he could be my uncle if I was a human. I mean, no wonder the NCSA would have a grudge against Cambridge. To be completely serious, no, even though the NCSA would be pissed that this clinically diagnosed autistic man is a professor at Cambridge, and would probably do an hour-long podcast expose about how he's a disability fraudster making a mockery of the struggles of their defenseless autistic children and patients, his presence at the university as a professor who claims to have autism, even though it would mark Cambridge as a radicalized institution to the NCSA, with an agenda against real autistic people, at least I guess. Anyway, as far as the autism study the NCSA is bitching about in the Spectrum News article, it has nothing to do with this guy in any way I could find, and I dug deep trying to prove that to be the case, because it would make a lot of things make a lot more sense, but nothing about this makes sense.
Many hide their diagnosis from their colleagues because they worry they will be stigmatized. Never mind that the fact this survey they're referring to was conducted by a ideological group. And I think it was very, very questionable methods, but nevertheless. So this is what Spectrum News considers to be autism. This is, and we just heard it, sensory overload, communication, and difficulty expressing emotions. Okay, that describes a lot of people I know who don't have autism. So this is what I want to pose to you guys.
And that's not what Canner initially described. So autism is
most definitely not.
Whether or not that group is ideologically driven or not, in this podcast episode, Jill and her friends at the NCSA speak about the work of Leo Kanner and research and writing done about autism as far back as the 70s, as though that work was the infallible orthodox canon scripture of autism, and that scientific discovery made in the 50 years since then that conflicts with that doctrine is therefore heretical to consider.
But those individuals really have very little to nothing in common with the types of individuals that I work with. And I think you alluded to some of the early research on autism, that the types of patients that I work with are, and that's not what Kanner initially described. So autism is
most definitely not.
But unfortunately, it just really bears no semblance to what autism was when it was initially described by Kanner, when it was studied in like the 70s by Rutter, and I mean all the like research that we have on autism is not what currently people are terming autism, and that does do a disservice to those who have, I guess, more classic or more true forms of autism.
I have to agree. So, that's exactly the issue, the classic definition of autism.
A lot of these issues with like identity and cancellation and this new stuff that we've had to deal with in the United States are particularly driven by like the younger generation, who I think like really has very little to no knowledge, outside of healthcare professionals, of what autism really can look like, unless they've had like a family member who has the type of autism that Kanner like initially described.
Yeah, that makes the NCSA itself look like an ideological group with a biased agenda.
Surveys estimate that about 1% of doctors, primarily GPs and psychiatrists, are autistic. Never mind that the fact this survey they're referring to was like conducted by like, a ideological group. And I think it was very, very questionable methods, but nevertheless.
Imagine having a stick so far up your ass over the thought of disabled people being present within a respected profession that your immediate response upon reviewing a statistic estimating that they make up only 1% of that profession's active practitioners is to accuse that 1% statistic of being an artificially inflated figure that biased ideologues concocted as propaganda to make the specified disabled population seem larger and more significant than it can possibly ever be. As pathetic of a response as that reaction is, it sure makes sense that a theoretical 1% of doctors being autistic would be upsetting to Jill, given that just 4 or 5 minutes ago in podcast episode time, she accused the U.S. Federal Advisory Commission on Autism of being stacked with a cadre of high-functioning autistic people whose mere presence on the committee marginalized others on that council's roster, when the total number of council members described as autistic in their official biographies accounted for less than 13%.
Surveys estimate that about 1% of doctors, primarily GPs and psychiatrists, are autistic. Never mind that the fact this survey they're referring to was like conducted by like, a ideological, group. And I think it was very, very questionable methods, but nevertheless.
All right, so let's say that this survey was conducted using hideously faulty methods. Let's say that 1% figure was a radical overestimation of the number of practicing physicians who have clinical autism diagnoses. Let's say that the real number was not 1%, but 0.0001%. That being not 1 in every 100, but 1 in every 1 million. Why shouldn't that 1 in a million exception be treated with respect based on the quality of their work instead of being laughed at for simply having an autism diagnosis and then speaking out when they're stigmatized over it? And by an autism advocacy nonprofit, no less. Later on in the podcast, all 3 of these panelists will say that they respect the challenges that physicians like Dr. Javed face. They will say that they respect their right to call themselves autistic in line with their official diagnoses. They will say that they would judge the quality of their work rather than their merely having an autism diagnosis. These 3 somehow seem to recognize those as the correct sounding things to say, to not seem like disability bigots. But simply by their conducting of this discussion the way that they are, and deciding that it benefited the NCSA's objectives to broadcast it to the public, they've proved that they aren't interested in actually acting on those words. Because in this podcast episode, all three of them will team up in literally laughing at the people discussed in this article, rejecting their struggles as valid disabilities, rejecting their right to call themselves autistic, rejecting their clinically administered diagnoses, and judging the quality of their character by associating them with hypocritical or even explicitly racist and genocidal ideas that were either not discussed or implied within the article they're discussing from, or are based on NCSA interpretations of the fundamentals of the neurodiversity paradigm, which happen to be contrary to principled positions on disability shared by most organized autistic self-advocates who are outspoken neurodiversity proponents.
Never mind that the fact this survey they're referring to was like conducted by a ideological group, and I think it was very, very questionable methods, but nevertheless. So this is what Spectrum News considers to be autism. This is, and we just heard it, sensory overload, communication.
Oh my God!
Holy shit! This is what Spectrum News considers to be autism. This is, and we just heard it.
Wait, that's it? You're stopping? You're stopping there?
This is what Spectrum News considers to be autism. This is, and we just heard it.
Wow, you're actually stopping now? You actual fucking coward. Jill, if you're watching this, you must be shitting your pants right now because you already know how outrageously full of shit you are for stopping at that point in the article. And I'm gonna hold you and your dumbass friends accountable for it, even if I have to do 2 or 3 more videos after this one to explain how fucked up you are. I mean, why read only 9% of the Spectrum News article when you're gonna have an in-depth discussion about it and what a setback its publication is to your defenseless, suffering autistic children? What an insult it is to their suffering. To be direct, the NCSA reading and criticizing only 9% of the article is probably more mercy than the article itself deserves, Jill, given that it's so bad that it spurs you to plan with your doctor friends in this podcast how the NCSA can mobilize to combat the violently absurd people less severely disadvantaged than your own kids who dare to have voices in the disability community under the autism spectrum disorder label currently in place. And for those who somehow need a reminder, yes, Jill called the concept of high-functioning autism discussed in this article to be a violent absurdity against her children in another NCSA podcast episode.
But yeah, I mean, I think this has been one of the great debacles of autism, right? That, people who are cognitively, have strong cognitive abilities, strong communication abilities, strong adaptive abilities, but have kind of social quirks, are in the same category, the same diagnostic category as my kids who are nonverbal and function like at a preschool level.
And that's a problem.
It's absurd. It's not just a problem. I mean, it's violently absurd. It's radically absurd.
Jill, if you think the issues discussed in this article that you think is so terrible are really that important, it's really suspicious to me that you only read about 9% of the article. This article serves as the axis for the roundtable discussion that is the main feature of your podcast episode, an episode that, due to you filming an additional segment at the beginning of it about a mainstream entertainment celebrity's autism diagnosis, is going to have a lot more eyes on it than a typical episode of Autism Confidential. Somehow, you really wanted to give this particular episode the best chance of being seen by a audience outside of the, I guess, disability discourse community as their first point in contact on these issues. I mean, if you kept reading the article past the mere 9% you felt was important enough to mention to your podcast audience, I would have been really amused to hear what you and your friends had to say. So in a certain way, I am disappointed. But the fact that you strategically chose to stop reading the article there is probably a stronger indication of your intention to deceive your audience than whatever stupid shit you and your friends were going to say if you kept reading. You know what? I changed my mind. I retract everything I just said. I'm going to chalk this up to pure luck. For no real reason, I've decided that Jill is the kind of person who frolics through life with Lady Luck's hand on her shoulder. It's a good thing for her and her autism advocacy organization that she picked a 4-leaf clover on the morning she recorded that podcast. Because if she wasn't so coincidentally lucky to randomly decide to stop reading the article being discussed at that particularly convenient point, only 9% of the way through its word count, and that article happened to continue and happened to discuss clinically documented disabled people that had been marginalized and discriminated against for disclosing their autism diagnoses. Well, if that were to have happened, it sure would make Jill and everyone associated with her autism advocacy group look like irredeemable bigoted shit stains if they read those things out loud and proceeded to complain about how extreme and weird the article is and how it's part of a violently absurd misinformation campaign to marginalize who the NSCA calls true autistic people. And that would be too bad for their organization's credibility.
And that does do a disservice to those who have, I guess, more classic or more true forms of autism.
But luckily, since that didn't happen, we could let Jill go on to provide the indignant commentary and criticism based on the isolated 9% of the article she wants us to trust is weird and extreme propaganda designed to invalidate the struggles of real autistic people and their families and doctors. I want to remind everyone that the NCSA decided not to link to this article, almost like they didn't want the people watching their podcast to actually read their source material. Well, how about this? If Jill only wants to read that far into the article, how about I end part 7 of barrier aggression right here, and we could let Jill and her stupid friends bury themselves in their own refuse later in part 8. I'll see you all next time, and thanks for watching. Damn it.